help us make sense of our changing relationship to the US and to China, we are now joined by former ambassador to the US, Michael Kergin. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you very much, Michael. Glad to be with you and Nick. Absolutely.
So we have a new administration, President Joe Biden, but after 4 years of Trump's handling of the pandemic, do you think it's really created a lasting impact on how Canadians view the US?
I think handling the pandemic probably hasn't had a great impact on Canadians. Certainly how he's managed and being someone who's a demagogue who has riled up and incited violence and been very inconsistent in his foreign policy, not working traditionally with his allies. Those are lasting problems of the Trump, and many of us, I think, and many Canadians will be looking to see whether Biden can kind of reconstitute what is more the traditional U.S. policy towards its allies. But that, I think, is a much more critical question. Certainly, there's a lot of optimism and a lot of anticipation, but at the same time, it has to be tempered with the thought that the United States is extremely bitterly divided, both politically. His Senate, as you know, is at 50-50 with the Vice President Kamala Harris throwing the deciding vote. But nevertheless, you lose one Democrat or two Democrats on legislative programs that Biden wants to put through, which are quite ambitious. It's going to be very difficult for him to get his agenda through. The agenda that he has, though, Michael, I think is one that Canadians are quite comfortable with. When you sort of look at the environment, you look at his efforts to re-engage internationally with allies, with the multilateral institutions. These are areas that Canada's traditionally been very supportive of. So I think there's a lot of hope and optimism, but very much tempered by a recognition that the politics of it in the United States are going to be very, very difficult for the president. And we'll have to just hold our breath to see how much he can accomplish of what is apparently and seems to be a very ambitious agenda.
You know, you mentioned, sorry,
It's interesting, Michael. You know, I remember we did a poll. One of the polls that we did, we asked about what contributes to a positive relationship in Canada and the United States, and it'd be like legislators working together, the president and the prime minister working together, and what the poll suggested was tone at the top. Really, that you know, if there was a perception that the prime minister had a fair and good working relationship with the president, that actually would be a key signal. And I think to your point, Michael, Canadians have to think it's got to be better than it was. But to your point, I think we're still hostage to a certain extent of the domestic political situation in the United States that you rightly put your finger on.
Nick, I just want to touch on something Michael said. He said, you know, Biden has a very ambitious climate plan. And when you have tracked the major issues that, you know, the Canadians rank, climate has always been there, and you see it as growing. So how does that impact our relations?
Well, you know, the thing is, it could be something of alignment, because we do know from recent research that we did with the University of Ottawa that Canadians want to be a little more, are okay with being, what I'll say, climate ambitious, even if it costs jobs. But here's the kicker, and I'm not sure, you know, I'm sure Michael can add something to this. Canadians always gauge themselves against the United States. So why don't we just look at the environment? If we have an environmental program that is on par with the United States or better than the United States, we're feeling okay. But if Joe Biden comes out with an environmental program and platform that is more ambitious than Canada, Canadians are not going to feel good. So, you know, the big question is, how ambitious will President Biden be on the environment, and what will the impact be on the Canadian domestic kind of environmental platform?
That's absolutely true, Nick. If you know, Biden starts to leapfrog, you know, Canadian, for example, in greenhouse gas emissions or tailpipe emissions and that sort of thing, that obviously will pose problems. It'll pose up problems economically for our exports to the United States, because if our exports are not perceived by the Biden administration to be have inputs that are environmentally friendly, we could see, you know, the imposition of what they call border carbon taxes, or that could be, against us. I think the fact of the matter is, though, is that Biden is going to be constrained in being too ambitious on the environment, going back to the problems he has with the Senate and even with the House, which is a very, very narrow majority.
Mm-hmm.
So his key swing vote on the Democratic side is Joe Manchin. Joe Manchin is the senator from West Virginia, Democrat, and he's going to be holding back a little bit on anything that looks as being too ambitious when it comes to fossil fuels. So that's one problem. The other problem we have, Nick, obviously, is, if you see the problem from the other side of the equation, is that Biden, as you know, the very first day, he rescinded the Keystone Pipeline thing. And that, for our Alberta and for our resource base in Saskatchewan and so on, is a problem, because they're now saying, well, how do we get our fossil fuels to Tidewater when we don't have, the Trans Mountain pipeline built yet? So we're kind of between two extremes there. On one side, we want to get more fossil fuels into the U.S. because it's good for our export industry. On the other side, we have to be careful to stay up with the Americans, because I think Nick's absolutely right. If Canadian population feels that we're falling behind the Americans, that'll have a political cost, I think, in Ottawa for sure.
I was curious to you, Nick. The Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was pretty quick to kind of put the Keystone issue behind us. Do you think that was the appropriate political reaction for him?
Yeah, this was dead in the water as soon as we knew that as soon as Biden was going to win, that this would be at the top of the list. It's an easy lift for him. It's an executive order. It allows him to tick a box and send a signal to some of the more progressive parts of his party. And the fact of the matter is America's energy self-sufficient now. So it's not, we don't have the same kind of heft and levers that we did 15, 20 years ago. And but what Ambassador Kergin has put his finger on, which is critical, is it just takes one senator can hold this administration hostage because of this 50-50 split. So this is a whole new dynamic compared to the past, where at least the Republicans had a little bit more of a working majority in the Senate.
That's right. Absolutely.
Right off the bat, I think the filibustering became an issue where Mitch McConnell wasn't willing to let that go at the start. So they were really off to a rocky start. Michael, I want to get into our relations with China now. I mean, Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig have been in detention for quite a long time now. Under the previous U.S. administration, our prime minister asked Trump to address the issue with China, and we didn't see any change in their situation. So what was the lesson from there? And do you think the Biden administration will be able to help?
This is a difficult file, Michael, and it's a subterranean file, because we don't really know below the surface what is exactly happening. Remember that the extradition against Madame Meng was brought by the Department of Justice. It's seen as a legal issue from the American perspective. You can agree or not agree with the sanctions and all the rest of it, but from their perspective, it's a legal issue. What made it a bit political was, at one point, Donald Trump said, well, maybe, or implied, in our trading relationship with China, maybe I can do something, which was, from a perspective of the law, was a anomaly with respect to how you deal with extradition issues. Now, Biden has made it very clear that the Department of Justice is absolutely independent of the political arena. He's got Merrick Garland as his attorney general, and he's made that a very... So my sense of it is that Biden will be very respectful of the legal aspects of this. The legal aspects are that the extradition treaty is still, the call on Meng is still there. We have seen reports in the Wall Street Journal that they may have offered a deferred prosecution agreement, a DPA, to Meng's lawyers. For the moment, she has not accepted those. She's probably waiting until next month, where there's going to be another hearing on the whole issue, whether her rights were violated in the form and process of detention when she was detained off the aircraft when she was transiting into Mexico. We don't know whether Meng will accept a deferred prosecution agreement. She may wait to see what happens in this next trial hearing. The actual trial, I believe, is in April, where they then get it down to the issue of the question of whether she was actually guilty in terms of of what the Americans are alleging. So we don't know whether Meng is going to accept a deferred prosecution agreement. Secondly, we don't know if the American offer of a deferred prosecution agreement is conditional on the two Michaels being released. We don't know that. It could be, it might not be. Secondly, we don't know whether, if it were linkage, whether the Chinese would accept that, because they've been saying the two Michaels are subject to espionage charges, and they say there's no linkage between those two. So there's a number of issues here that are hurdles that have to go through. So I don't think things are going to move very quickly on this one, as far as I can tell. And I do not see Biden interfering with the process politically that now is very much in a legal sort of channel. So I think while Biden is informed about it, and they talked about it in their phone call just recently, my guess is that the Biden is going to kind of let this thing play out for a while.
You know, this, if we were to sum this whole thing up, it's kind of like we've got the Chinese rock and the American hard place, and we're stuck in between.
Yes, sir.
There's no easy solution for this. But one thing that we do know, you know, Canadians aren't experts in extradition things, on trade issues, on technology and all that stuff. But, you know, what we've seen through the polling is what's seeping through is kind of Canadians increasingly being hesitant about better relations with China. It's kind of like all these things are kind of adding up where it's on the radar for an average Canadian. You know, one survey that we did actually with CTV News, which just was quite surprising for me, because Canada is a trading nation, is when we asked Canadians whether they think that we should trade more or less or the same amount with China, by a margin of more than 4-1, Canadians said we should have less trade with China. And this is at the same time where Canadians understand that China is one of the two most important and biggest markets in the world, and that maybe in 10 years could even overtake the United States in terms of size. And but the complexities that former Ambassador Kergin is talking about, and the difficulty in having any kind of resolution, just casts a pall on the Canada-China relationship right now. And I think it's at like loggerheads. No one knows how to break the logjam on this.
Michael, it's always been a tension with China between human rights and trade. I mean, in your time as ambassador, I remember then Prime Minister Jean Chrétien was leading trade missions as well. And the question always came up, how reasonable is it to Canadians expect us to trade less with China? Is that possible?
I think it is possible, Michael. It's always a tricky file, that balance between the profits you get from selling your goods abroad and respecting human rights norms, which Canada obviously subscribes to internationally and multinationally. I mean, just look at the LAV exports to Saudi Arabia, and you see that dynamic or that conflict playing out quite obviously. I think with China, we actually do have options with China. We are fortunate that we are part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which opens up theoretically a better trading relationship for Canada with other members of Asia, ASEAN, for example, Vietnam. And these are countries that are economically becoming more interesting markets. Their economies are developing. They're developing a middle class. They need natural resources. So we probably have some options diversifying our trade on one side. On the other side is that Canadians are becoming increasingly, as Nick has put it so well, worried about the Chinese sort of predatory, mercantilist approach. And so the government is starting to dial back a little bit on Chinese investments in sort of what we consider secure areas of our economy. Take the North, take mining and so forth. And so we can cut back on Chinese investment in Canada, which is another tool, if you might say, we have expressing a little bit our problems, our condemnation of their human rights activities. And it's not getting better. I mean, they're getting tougher on the Uyghurs. They're undercutting what's happening in Hong Kong. They're starting to threaten Taiwan. And all those three areas are things that Canadians, I think, feel concerned about. So my sense of it is that we will be leaning more heavily on the human rights side. And in that respect, I think the Biden administration will be very supportive, and they themselves will start to weigh in more heavily than Trump did, for example. So there is, misery loves company.
On that note, former ambassador to the U.S., Michael Kergin, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure, Michael. And nice to talk to Nick as well. Thank you very much.